there. There we are.
Hi. Well, let's just wait for folks to come in then.
Yes, there's no one yet.
There's no one yet. It's just 5 o'clock. And it takes a few minutes for them to come in.
And I'm guessing that Harold might not be the only one that looks up and goes, oh yeah, there was that thing.
Especially our first really beautiful weekend.
Yep. Yep. And this is the first in the series. So 5 watching now. Hi, people.
Hi, folks.
Oh, I could probably watch this on our YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, just be sure you mute it.
Okay.
Or we'll get an echo.
Add feedback.
Okay, maybe I'll just leave well enough alone.
So say hi as people are coming in.
Hello.
They can say hi in the chat to tell us who you are.
Yes.
We can hear you typing.
We are really here. We're just waiting for everybody to get here. Give you all a few minutes.
14, that's more than show up for you and I, Kit.
We're doing great. I'll give it about 1 more minute. Let's see who turns up.
I don't think I deleted the other Zoom site when I finished service this morning.
It was that bad.
No, I try to not have the emails,
Oh, right.
all pile up.
Yeah.
I have Susie.
Okay.
Coffee.
Well, let's get started. Welcome everyone to our first session on the topic of reparations and the church and what they might have to do with one another. We're very honored today to have Dr. Pero Dagbovie from the Michigan State University with us. And a little bit about him. He is the University Distinguished Professor in the Department of History and an Associate Dean in the Graduate School at Michigan State. Before joining MSU in 2003, he was an assistant professor at Wayne State University in the College of Lifelong Learning for 3 years. He is the editor of the Journal of African American History, the oldest and leading journal devoted to scholarship on African American history that was founded more than a century ago by the father of Black history, Dr. Carter G. Woodson. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in African American history and actively mentors graduate students. Active in public history, he has worked with K-12 educators, museums, and the National Park Service. He is currently writing a book on the history of the African American presence at MSU from the 1890s until the late 20th century. And so welcome, Dr. Dagbovie. I'm going to put you on speaker view, and we are eager to hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much for that gracious introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I have prepared a brief paper that I hope will open the door to a useful conversation. And I'm going to use the award-winning author Ta-Nehisi Coates' essay, A Case for Reparations, published in The Atlantic in 2014, as a point of departure. And I was told that many of y'all might have had an opportunity to examine this piece. And let me apologize in advance for the fact that I'll be looking down from time to time while I'm speaking, because I will be reading from a paper. And if we were in person and not virtually, I promise you that I would probably be speaking from the pulpit and would be a little more dynamic because I'd be able to feed off of some in-person personal energy. So hopefully you can just bear with me today. When talking about Ta-Nehisi Coates' A Case for Reparations, we need to note that his essay belongs to a larger tradition, and he certainly is not the first activist to write about the issue of reparations. Black activists have been concerned with reparations for more than a century. Just so that we're all on the same page, reparations is the making of amends for a wrong that one has done by paying money or otherwise helping those who have been wronged. For African American people, reparations is the notion that some form of compensation should be made to Black people for slavery, Jim Crow segregation and discriminatory practices, race riots, lynchings, and other forms of racial oppression that have impacted African Americans' present status in measurable ways. As a national correspondent for The Atlantic, Ta-Nehisi Coates has published many important essays. Published in the summer of 2014, the essay, The Case for Reparations, is his most famous essay that is. His second major work, a book called Between the World and Me, really took him to a new level of recognition. Published in 2015 and inspired by James Baldwin's 1963, The Fire the Next Time, this book was a New York Times bestseller and was awarded the 2015 National Book Award. In 2015, Ta-Nehisi Coates also received the prestigious Genius Grant from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. It's not an exaggeration to say that Coates is one of the most popular and successful African-American intellectuals of his generation. The New York Times even crowned him, quote, one of the most nation's influential voices on race relations, end quote. In order to better understand Coates' essay on reparations, his role as a national correspondent for The Atlantic should be contextualized. The Atlantic magazine has been around since before the Civil War. In contemporary times, this magazine has been described as promoting a moderate worldview or as being slightly leftist in orientation. They often deal with issues of race relations, and The Atlantic's readership is predominantly white. So when Coates writes about Black subject matter in The Atlantic, he is often translating a Black perspective for his readership. In June 2014, Coates revived discussions about reparations in American culture with his lengthy essay that we're familiar with, The Case for Reparations. This is a long and very well-written essay. In fact, it's about 63 pages, large font if you print it out. Coates' 2014 essay is one of those essays that many have heard about, but may not have taken the time to read. It has become a part of American liberal literary culture at one level. Now, Coates is not a historian, but he borrows from the past. Not only did he sample the title of his essay from Boris I. Bitker's 1973 book on reparations and Robert Wesley's important 1998 essay, but Coates also recycled some of the numerous underlying arguments of leading reparationists. This gifted writer and thinker did, however, seek to translate reparations for a broader readership. Like others, Ta-Nehisi Coates builds a morally and historically grounded case by drawing upon different powerful examples. He essentially argues that the present disparities between Black Americans and white Americans were caused by slavery, Jim Crow segregation, anti-Black violence, failed affirmative action policies, and widespread discriminatory practices such as those in housing, mainly redlining, land ownership, education, incarceration rates, and political representation during much of the 20th century. For Ta-Nehisi Coates, things may have changed for African Americans over the last 50 plus years, but in many areas, such as income gaps and residential segregation, things have not changed that much. As he points out, these problems are firmly rooted in the past. In many ways, he demonstrates that poorer African Americans are caught in a vicious cycle that dates to the Great Migration and earlier. Coates maintains that reparations are not only about addressing past injustices, but need to include a massive transformation of Americans' worldviews. He does not contend that an apology is the first step towards reparations, yet for Coates, the United States needs to openly acknowledge and express genuine remorse for its past mistreatment of Black people. This quote unquote settling with old ghosts, as he calls it, is central to his 21st century vision of reparations. In terms of solutions, Coates stresses that the United States must, quote, face up to the particular history of white-imposed Black disadvantaged, end quote, that dates back far into US history. Coates adds, quote, America was built on the preferential treatment of white people, 395 years of it. Vaguely endorsing a cuddly feel-good diversity does little to address this, end quote. Coates deals with how to pay redress to African Americans only in passing. He mentions financial recompense as well as job training and public works. The wealth gap is central to his analysis. For Black progress to be realized, this gap, he stresses, should be closed. He acknowledges that this will take time and will challenge America to its core. He writes, quote, the idea of reparations is frightening, not simply because we might lack the ability to pay. The idea of reparations threatens something much deeper, America's heritage, history, and standing in the world, end quote. He continues, quote, so we must imagine a new country. Reparations, by which I mean the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences, is the price we must pay to see ourselves squarely. The recovering alcoholic may well have to live with his illness for the rest of his life, but at least he is not living a drunken lie. Reparations beckons us to reject the intoxication of hubris and see America as it is, the work of fallible humans. What I'm talking about is more than recompense for past injustices, more than a handout, a payoff, hush money, or a reluctant bribe. What I'm talking about is a national reckoning that would lead to spiritual renewal, end quote. So that large quote was not me speaking. It was from Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case of Reparations. As Coates admits in his essay, the discussion about reparations that he introduced to Atlantic readers is nothing new, and I've already said this. The movement, as I pointed out, has deep roots. Reparationists began calling upon the United States government to compensate African Americans for the unpaid labor of their ancestors and for racial discrimination more than 1 century before Coates' widely read essay appeared, as clearly demonstrated by Black woman activist Callie House's ex-slave Mutual Relief and Bounty Pension Association that was founded in 1897. In addition to Callie House's movement, the roll call of reparations activists prior to the end of the 1970s is very long, including, for instance, former enslaved Tennessean Jordan Anderson, Frederick Douglass, radical Reconstructionist Thaddeus Stevens, Cornelius J. Jones, Marcus Garvey, Queen Mother Audley Moore and her Reparations Committee of Descendants of United States Slaves, Malcolm X, the Republic of New Africa, Christopher Alston, James Forman, the National Black Economic Development Conference, and the National Black Political Assembly. I could go on of the precursors before Coates who'd been dealing with reparations. In 1987, a group of Black activists founded the National Coalition for Black Reparations in America, in COBRA. This organization is still at the forefront of the reparations movement. In January of 1989, Congressman John Conyers made history by first introducing H.R. 40, which has never moved to the floor of the House. H.R. 40 seeks to acknowledge the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery in the United States, and to establish a commission to study the effects of slavery and subsequent forms of systematic discrimination and racial oppression. Arguably, the most influential book on reparations for African Americans was published in 2000, a decade and a half before Coates' essay appeared. This book is Randall Robinson's monumental book entitled The Debt, What America Owes to Blacks. Randall Robinson's accessible book made a splash, jettisoning the issue of reparations into the mainstream. In a sense, he helped publicize the sentiments of more militant reparations spokespersons. In January of 2001, the book The Debt was Essence Magazine's #1 best-selling nonfiction title. In this book, The Debt, Randall Robinson did not mince his words in advocating for reparations or in describing Black people's collective suffering. Robinson insisted, quote, "No race, no ethnic or religious group has suffered so much over so long a span as Blacks have and still do at the hands of those who benefited with the connivance of the United States government from slavery and the century of legalized racial hostility that followed," end quote. For Robinson, Randall Robinson, reparations were the only viable solution for solving America's so-called race problem and alleviating the suffering of the masses of Black people in the United States. According to Robinson, reparations are necessary because the vast majority of African Americans still suffer because of America's quote unquote racial holocaust and the vicious climate that followed it. Now, Robinson did not offer a detailed step-by-step framework for how reparations could be best engineered and carried out. But he did stress that the US government and Americans in general needed to stop denying the crime and ignoring history. Ultimately, he made a plea for, at a minimum, a full-scale reparations debate. In reference to American society as a whole, he vented, quote, "First, it must own up to slavery and acknowledge its debt to slavery's contemporary victims. Once and for all, the United States must face its past, open itself to fair telling of all its people's history, and accept full responsibility for the hardships it has occasioned for so many," end quote. Now, the debates about reparations have expanded by leaps and bounds since they first started in the 19th century and have changed ever since Coates's 2014 essay. For instance, in the fall of 2016, the United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent offered a report that supported reparations. They wrote, quote, "Despite substantial changes since the end of the enforcement of Jim Crow and the fight for civil rights, ideology ensuring the domination of one group over another continues to negatively impact the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights of African Americans today. The dangerous ideology of white supremacy inhibits social cohesion amongst the US population. Past injustices and crimes against African Americans need to be addressed with reparatory justice," end quote. So let me end with a little bit of food for thought for contemporary discussions and debates about reparations. Law professor and leading reparationist scholar Alfred L. Brophy has succinctly defined reparations as, quote, "programs that are justified on the basis of past harm and that are also designed to assess and correct that harm and or improve the lives of the victims into the future," end quote. Apologies and truth commissions are often the first steps, followed by actions. When discussing African American reparations, the issues are many and the counter arguments are predictable and consistent. Those opposed to reparations, for instance, claim that no one group is responsible. Few white Americans own slaves. Blacks have already been given reparations with affirmative action. Reparations sends the country back. Slavery happened a long time ago, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is the counter arguments. For those who really want to deal with reparations, they of course need to go far beyond Coates's 21st century style consciousness raising. Issues that need to be dealt with include the law, lawsuits and legal doctrines, statutes of limitations, the basis of cases, calculating the harm, determining who will receive reparations and who will pay, using other cases as points of reference, and much more. Then there is the issue of how to repair the past injustices. Would that be through truth commissions, apologies, civil rights legislations, programs, and or individual payments? Now, one of the most recent books on reparations, published not too long ago, published in 2020, is entitled "From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black America in the 21st Century" by William A. Darity and A. Kirsten Mullen. And it recently won a major book award from the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. They argue that a reparations program can close the economic divide between Black and white Americans. Black reparations, they argue, quote, can place America squarely on the path to racial equality, end quote. For these authors, reparations involves acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice dating back to the days of slavery. The book is fascinating, looking at history and offering solutions, and I suggest that folks go check it out on Amazon or Google Books. When I'm asked if I really think that reparations is a reality, I'm usually somewhat pessimistic as a historian. At the same time, I pondered to myself, I bet that enslaved African Americans in the 1700s or the early to mid 19th century never thought that the 13th Amendment would have ever been passed in 1865. Many African Americans who came of age during the early years of Jim Crow segregation probably never imagined that the Supreme Court would rule in the way that it did in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. In the reparations movement for African Americans, there have been some small gains. Apologies from businesses, universities, states, and even the Senate apology for slavery, reparations paid to the descendants of the victims of the race riot in Rosewood, Florida, payouts to Southern Black farmers in the amount of millions in the 21st century, and more investigations carried out here and there. When compared to other groups that have received reparations from the United States government, African Americans have a long way to go. Essays like Coates's The Case for Reparations, or a book like the one by Darity and Mullen, are not the solution in and of themselves, but can help in the consciousness raising process. In order to frame a thoughtful stance on reparations, wherever one falls in the debate, knowledge of US history in general, especially from the founding of the nation in 1789 until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, is a prerequisite. More importantly, in order to really understand the issue of reparations to African Americans, one must know something about African American history, particularly how African American people have been treated in the United States. Black history, after all, is a history characterized by racial oppression and resistance. It's a history of struggle, resistance, grinding it out, and survival. I will stop there. Thank you very much for listening, and I guess we can proceed to whatever the next phase is. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. What I thought we would do is Donna and Val and I will start the conversation with you, and then we can take some questions from the chat as well. And so I guess my first question is, do you think this national reckoning about reparations is actually starting to happen, with Georgetown and Evanston, Illinois, and HR 40 actually having some movement in Congress last week? Do you think we're actually starting to work on this?
I think that it's been kind of a continuous effort that has taken place over a very long period of time, and the debate and the movement is entering into a different phase. As I had mentioned, we can date back the reparations movement all the way back to the period of slavery, the antebellum era, or later during the progressive era with activists like Callie House. And over the course of more than 100 years, the reparations movement has undergone various iterations and various phases. So I would say that we are at a particular moment in a larger movement that is building upon previous efforts. And the contemporary movement would not exist without those past movements. And it's interesting to try and interpret the present in and of itself without reflecting upon the past sometimes. And sometimes we believe that we're living in moments that are unprecedented when in reality, they're not. So I would say that it's gaining traction and it continues to gain traction as a movement. And there are small victories that have been gained along the way and will probably continue into the future. And you're correct to point out the various different cases that have happened recently that add more further momentum to a larger historical movement.
Donna or Val, do you want to jump in here? You guys can unmute and jump in anytime.
I'm just wondering about changing people's hearts and minds. I mean, it would be great to think that people would actually dive into history and understand the historical trajectory that has led us to today, but actually doing that and then changing your mind about folks that have been falsely imprisoned who are still falsely imprisoned today, still in prison over some trumped up charges, and just letting them go free. I mean, actually having people change their way of thinking about what is happening now. What would it take to do that? I mean, brushing up on your history, I think it would take more than that because we're entrenched in our lived experiences of today. Having people think, oh, that means I have to give up something, you know, that's what they think reparations is about. How do we approach that?
I think that our contemporary opinions about the past are, of course, molded by however it is that we learn about the past. And an important prerequisite for all historians is reading and conducting research. And unfortunately, in many cases, we're not encouraged to take deep dives from various perspectives into the past. History is not written in one particular way. In fact, historian of the Russian Revolution, Edward Hallett Carr, in his book, What is History, basically said that history means interpretation, the interpretations of historians, that history just doesn't come to us from above and it becomes the word. History is highly contested, messy, and full of different perspectives. And so, what I would argue is that in order to develop an informed perspective about contemporary phenomenon that's linked to the past, one has to be willing to read from various perspectives and do research. I really wouldn't want to have a conversation or debate with anyone about the issue of reparations if they were not somewhat well versed in United States history or African American history. Certainly, I wouldn't like to get into a discussion with someone if they didn't know about the institution of slavery in the United States or Jim Crow segregation, because without that knowledge and that information, one cannot understand the contemporary debates. And there's oftentimes the discussion of why people are waiting for so long to bring issues up. That's never really been the case with reparations. Reparations was called upon even during the period of slavery, but folks were existing in time periods when it wasn't even anything that was going to be somewhat of a conversation. And so as time elapsed and we went through different revolutions and reforms in the country, space and time opened to where we could have certain types of dialogues about issues that in the past one could not talk about at all. And so I think American history, like the history of all different countries and places throughout the world, has gone through various incarnations, and a lot of progress, of course, has been made. And with that progress, there becomes reckonings, because a lot of people are discovering things for the first time that they never knew before, including myself. The more scholarship that I end up reading on a regular basis. I read a book the other day that I'm embarrassed that I hadn't read in a while, An Indigenous History of the United States by author named Dunbar Ortiz. And she situated US history within the context of settler colonialism. And it was a concept that I'm somewhat familiar with, of course, but I didn't frame US history that way. And it really made me rethink dimensions of Native American, Indigenous US history in ways that I was not used to doing because of how most US history courses, textbooks are framed. That's a long response to probably a more straightforward question.
Well, actually, your response helped me think of another response to even my question, and that's the power of actually using even K-12 education to maybe change the course of the future trajectory. Because as a K-12 educator who taught children from textbooks that were written with a particular perspective in mind, with an entire people's history ignored in those textbooks, maybe we can start to shape the future thought with just what we teach to our children, and perhaps that can be passed on. I can tell you that having grown up under Jim Crow segregation myself, and having been within a family whose early access to denial to wealth had a total direct one-on-one connection with redlining, folks don't necessarily want to hear you tell that story. They go, oh yeah, well, that was then. We're here now. Okay, so get over it. But possibly if we actually start talking about that and having those conversations with the youngest of our children, maybe they will start talking to their parents, you know, that kind of thing. That would be a hope. Because I don't really have a lot of hope for actually grown adult, smart people sitting down and reading our history. I don't know. It'd be great, but
yeah. And Val, I wonder, I worry, but wonder is probably more helpful. When we white folks start to have this conversation, I wonder if sometimes we're looking for a way to write a check to get rid of a problem, which we are often want to do. And so the caution or the direction that we need to actually do a little more work than that is helpful. And like you, Val, I'm not real confident that grown folks will do it.
Or after you write that check, is it okay if a person of color or an indigenous person or whatever moves next door to you?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, let's try that.
Yeah.
Let's see what happens. Yeah.
Yeah, there's also the tension, I think, between the American story versus American history, especially for those of us who grew up when communism was like the biggest threat you could possibly imagine. We were counter indoctrinated with this idea of America as a land of goodness. Lincoln freed the slaves. We're for truth and unity and everybody holding hands. And, you know, I think it's difficult for people to read the kind of history that would lead you to a conversation about reparations because, and I think Coates gets at this in his essay too, that it takes away our idea of what America, I'm going to use air quotes again, is. That America is good. It's the best country in the world.
It's free.
It's free. And actually, we have the same issue with the history of the Episcopal Church, which nobody reads unless you're in seminary. In that the Episcopal Church was one of the few denominations that did not split over the issue of slavery, unlike the Presbyterians and the Methodists. But we did that at a cost by basically accommodating the Southern Episcopal churches, however they wanted to be. So our own history is complex too, and also needs to be told and learned and deconstructed.
Yeah, and I don't know about you, but when I was taught that the Episcopal Church didn't split over slavery, that was a great success story. That was something to be celebrated. Yay, we're so proud because we didn't split over slavery, over the Civil War.
So, Pero, I'm wondering about some thoughts that people have about what reparations might look like in terms of like different parameters to put on mortgage lending or business grants or school loans and things like that. Is that part of something that has come up in your classes as ways of how to start this reparation today?
You know, I'm not really teaching this topic actively in the classroom right now.
Oh, okay, all right.
But in the news, there have been a host of different examples. I believe that something recently, this can be Googled, happened in Evanston, Illinois, in terms of housing. But there will be plenty of debates about how reparations would be administered. And I don't think it's going to be anything that's going to be a simple formula.
Right.
And there would be some who would argue that affirmative action was a form of quote unquote reparations. But again, I think that one has to put on the hat of a legal scholar to understand some of these issues more deeply. And there are plenty of lawyers who have written books about this topic. So it could happen in many different ways, and it has happened in many different ways. I had mentioned the case in Rosewood, Florida, where there was a massive race riot in the early 1920s. So that's an example. But there are other examples that might not involve perhaps payouts, but education, housing, memorials, etc. I mean, there's no one size fits all approach. And again, recent cases in the news with African-American farmers have been brought up as an example, and it's been highly debated. It's been highly politicized, but one can look at those examples as well.
Let's start taking some of the questions out of the chat. Dustin wants to know, what suggestions do you have for individuals or groups that want to pursue acts of reparations? And Kevin kind of tags on that and says, can you point to some examples of, and you kind of just did with the farmers in Rosewood, institutions or communities that have engaged in reparations so that we can think further about what it might look like in practice?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of organizations nationally out there right now. I had mentioned INCOBRA, but I would definitely recommend for anyone who's interested in any of these type of recent issues to look at the book that I mentioned during my talk that just came out and won a major book award by Darity and Mullen. And the book again is called From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black America in the 21st Century. From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black America in the 21st Century. It addresses all of these major issues in a more eloquent, more well-researched manner than I would. I'm not an expert in this area. I study it by virtue of it being a direct byproduct of African-American history.
Are you still looking at, I don't have the chat up there, so you seeing some of the chat questions, Keith?
Yeah, I'm looking at the chat.
Sorry.
Is there a consensus among Black groups about what adequate reparations might be?
The answer is unequivocally no. Just as around pretty much all social justice issues within the quote unquote Black community, if such a community exists, because there are many Black communities and many perspectives within the Black community. So there are different approaches to reparations. There are moderate approaches, mild approaches, more quote unquote radical approaches. So it pretty much runs the gamut, just like, let's say, during the period of slavery when we were looking at abolition, right? You had those who were probably like gradualists versus those who were like Nat Turner or John Brown, right? Who took a much different, more quote unquote radical approach. But again, notions of radicalism vary as well. But there's many different approaches. There's not common agreement. I haven't seen any type of major polls that have been taken surveying different populations within American society to see where they might fall on this issue. But I'm assuming that there would be some correlations between people's race and ethnicity sometimes in terms of how folks would vote on this issue. But again, within the Black community, there are many different approaches to reparations, from those who are adamant to those who might not be as concerned for different reasons. There are some who might even view it as not being a quote unquote practical solution for the here and now if one thinks about how long the struggle might take to get to a certain phase. So again, it runs the gamut.
Willie asks, now that HR 40 has passed from the committee status, does this encourage you? Like we can now work harder while the iron is hot?
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And I will confess that I've had a lot of things on my mind and been following a lot of things, so I haven't read up on this recent development. So
I looked it up. It happened 4 days ago. So
4 days ago.
You're off the hook.
Okay, so I'm off the hook a little bit, but this is the thing: is things happen at such a rapid pace. So I'm going to have to check it out. But again, it's a step. You know, it's a step from when it was first tried to be introduced in the late 1980s. So it's moving. So we'll have to see what happens next. I mean, if one takes a look at the various apologies that states throughout the country have issued for slavery and Jim Crow segregation, right? Or the Senate's apology for not instituting anti-lynching legislation, one will notice that all of those apologies came with certain caveats, right? That this apology does not allow further actions to be taken in the courts, that this is just an apology. So we'll have to see how HR 40 ends up being framed to be able to make better sense of it. And there probably will be, you know, advocates and those who resist it, of course.
Yeah, I wonder if folks know that it's HR 40 because the original promise of Reconstruction was that the freed slaves would get 40 acres and a mule. I don't know if people know that it has the number 40 on purpose. Paulette asks, in terms of changing hearts and minds and also building consensus among citizens for a need for making amends and reparations, would post-World War II Germany have anything to teach us?
I guess there are many examples from the past that could be instructive to contemporary debates about reparations in the United States. And this is not a new concept. And reparations, in quotation marks, have been awarded to certain populations in the United States, even around the era of World War II. And I guess that whenever there's recompense paid to various groups for past mistreatment, they can be used as some type of example for different groups. However, one has to be cautious in comparing different experiences because the contexts are very, very different. It's just like discussions revolving around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the broadening of notions of what diversity, equity, and inclusion mean since the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 has, in some cases, led to every quote unquote so-called marginalized group in American culture being lumped together without understanding the nuances between various populations, each of whom have distinctly different historical experiences and pasts that have influenced present situations in a myriad of manners.
I wonder if are there more questions?
No, go ahead. We're waiting for more questions in the chat. Go ahead, Val.
I'm just curious if you think that the election of Barack Obama and then the election that came after that might have any impact on people's thinking about reparations. After all, we had a Black president, so what else do you want, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that's feasible. I've never examined that in particular, but all one would have to do to explore what you've just raised is look at the contemporary mainstream media particularly newspapers, after Barack Obama was elected president. I think it was on the front page of the New York Times where a journalist said something like, um, everything is good for Black America now because there is an African American president. And there was this notion that the United States, by virtue of having an African American president, had suddenly leapt into the realm of being a quote unquote post-racial society.
Mhm.
And it's a very interesting concept to explore. One of my favorite books on this topic is by Michael Eric Dyson. Michael Eric Dyson wrote a great book on Barack Obama's presidency. And part of his argument is that one needs to move beyond the symbolic. The symbolic is very important. Let's not get it totally twisted. However, there are clear limitations to that, symbolic. There's some clear limitations to that symbolic. There was a political scientist at the University of Michigan, Haynes Walton, who wrote an excellent book on American presidents and their disposition towards Black America. And one would probably be very interested to see the US presidents that ranked in different ways towards their treatment of Black America according to Professor Walton's perspective. And what he did was look at legislation, conditions, et cetera. And so Barack Obama's presidency certainly had significant impact on this country in many different ways. And I would argue that there was also, heightened backlash. And all you have to do is, look at the historical record. And it seems
Absolutely.
that historically speaking, ever since, let's say, the passage of the 13th Amendment or the 14th Amendment or the 15th Amendment or the Civil Rights Act of 64 or the Voting Rights Act of 65, there's been reactions to those gains. And that's usually how things happen in ebbs and flows, that when progress is made, there's also a reaction. So I would say that we can see that in contemporary times. Sometimes it's hard to see it when it's happening, and it's in retrospect that one can better understand it, just like understanding the present time when COVID-19 is quote unquote the norm, right? And we're talking about this new normal. We'll be able to better decipher this period that we're undergoing, and this is not rocket science, in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years, when we can really sit back with our historian's cap on and analyze everything that's going on. Because when stuff goes down in our present, when we're living it, we tend to think that it's the most important thing that's ever happened in the history of the country or world, when in reality, different generations, previous generations, were making the same argument with things that were happening then that were seemingly unprecedented.
Yeah, humans are like that. Jennifer asks, Black voices must be central in the public discussion of reparations and in writing history books. How can we help Black scholars gain this voice?
I would argue that Black scholars, African American scholars, have those voices and have had them for some time. There can always be more voices added to the mix, but there are many active Black scholars on the scene, not only as public intellectuals, but at colleges and universities throughout the nation. And one way that they can be supported is by purchasing their books, listening to, their speeches, following their blogs, and just supporting the scholarship that's being produced. And the production of Black scholarship has a deep, deep history going all the way back to, the antebellum era, and then proceeding with, the proliferation of Black scholars. The first African American, if we're talking about like professional scholars, to receive a PhD was Edward Alexander Boucher in 1876 from Yale in physics. And after, Reconstruction, ended, there was, the increase in African Americans attending historically Black colleges, universities, then later integrating mainstream institutions and getting, various degrees to help bolster their scholarship with the quote unquote scholarly credentials to do so. Not to say that if you don't have a PhD or a master's degree or a bachelor's that you cannot be a high powered scholar. But, by the early 20th century, there were critical masses and continuing to grow groups of Black scholars. So they're out there today. We can support them by reading the work.
And you've written a book about them.
I have. I'm interested in the history of Black historians in particular and the history of Black intellectuals. And I edit the Journal of African American History, which was founded by Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black history, more than 100 years ago. And he created this Black history movement and a Black history journal for this very reason, to make sure that African Americans and other scholars who wrote progressive Black history had a platform and had a voice to offer alternative interpretations of the American past that, when he created the organization, was not receptive to, let's say, positive portrayals of the African American experience. And we do know that the oppression of a people oftentimes is predicated upon denying that said people a past. Because if one doesn't have a past, then one probably doesn't have a culture or a future. And so Black scholars historically have been fighting to celebrate and demonstrate that.
Is the Journal of African American History available through the MSU library?
Yes, it is. Currently through JSTOR.
Okay. Yeah, so people who do have JSTOR accounts can get right to it. Pamela asks, do you feel that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission would be a good first step toward educating and convincing the public about the need for reparations?
I think that there have already been some of these Truth and Reconciliation efforts. And I guess my response to that will be, whatever's done has to be done carefully and well. Let me just put it that way, whatever it is. And there are templates out there for those who've been more successful than others. And it's really about how one positions it. But at the end of the day, it's not going to be comfortable for everybody, because it's one of those issues that's probably somewhat polarizing. But this is nothing new in the world or in American history. I mean, we've just come off the heels of an election that was quite polarizing, and people have different opinions about different topics and issues in American history and society based upon how we are socialized. And it doesn't mean that we can't change our ideas or be influenced by others, but oftentimes we're inevitably the byproducts of how we were socialized. And I guess one of the things that we encourage, at least in higher education, is that one studies various topics with quote unquote objectivity, whatever that means. Historians are supposed to, by virtue of the trade, be as objective as possible, which has its limits, but it means that one is open and receptive to analyzing sources and materials that might not gel necessarily with what one wants to argue based upon personal opinion.
Yeah. We have one last question, and Jennifer is following up on her other question about scholarship. And she wants to know if you feel that Blacks have a significant impact on school history and social studies books. And maybe Val's interested in that too, as the curriculums are developed for K-12 students. Is that Black scholarship represented there?
I guess it all depends. There are so many different K through 12 curriculums throughout the country, throughout the state, throughout Lansing, throughout East Lansing. I do think textbooks in general have improved, but there are still cases here and there where certain types of activities end up happening for some reason. I was reading, I think, the Lansing State Journal not too long ago, where I read an article about a school district in the area that had some exercise for students to engage in dealing with slavery.
Yeah, it was East Lansing Public Schools. It was in the Lansing State Journal and also East Lansing Information.
Right.
And they kept saying, but it's in the curriculum, it's in the curriculum. And people then had to back up and say,
Right.
why is this our curriculum then?
Right. So in cases where there are situations in that nature, there has to be revisions of curriculum. But there are places that are doing good jobs and places that are, perhaps not as doing as good job, however that might be construed. And I think that there needs to be more cross collaborations between professional historians who study the teaching of history and K through 12 teachers. And K through 12 teachers put a lot into teaching. I mean, both my parents were high school teachers, and I respect teachers, especially based on what they have to do on a day-to-day basis with young folks age K through 12. But there probably should be some more interactions and learning both ways too, not a top-down, here's the knowledge from the professors to K through 12 teachers, but learning both ways, because each group of educators have different strategies that could be used by each other. Just like in colleges and universities, some professors might be highly trained in the laboratories and in their cubicles writing scholarship, but their teaching might not be as effectual perhaps as those who are in the trenches in K through 12 education on a day-to-day basis, which is not easy work by any stretch of the imagination, especially now when dealing with COVID-19, and then with also having to teach for the test. And I don't want to get into that because we don't have enough time for that, but I think we can all agree with what that means, that we're teaching based upon how young people are going to be tested at different levels for their knowledge of whatever history means at that level. And that can be somewhat limiting. And some teachers might not in certain schools be able to go outside of that. So it is a challenging thing to deal with, but I think there needs to be some closer attention paid, or else there are going to be more instances where folks get called out for certain exercises that 20 or 30 years ago were acceptable, whereas today they're viewed with much more scrutiny.
Yeah.
I just wonder if you could give us some parting words as to what you think we interested people who seem to be interested in this topic might do in terms of not only learning more about it, but what action can people do that are listening to you?
Yeah, I don't want to cop out here. I am kind of tired from talking, but I'll just say this, that I think it starts with seeking out knowledge and seeking out information. And it's quite easy during these times at one level. And what do I mean by that? Well, one can type up whatever topic one wants to in various different search engines and find a whole bunch of sources. In fact, we can even read parts of books on Amazon or Google and other sources for free. And so there's a lot of information out there. The problem is that it's information overload. And sometimes if we don't have a critical lens, we might not know what sources are well-researched, quote unquote. I don't want to get into discussions about the truth. But what I do want to say is that we have the opportunity to educate ourselves on these issues from various perspectives. And that's my piece of advice, is when we want to learn about something, that we research it, and the answers are all out there. I oftentimes will have students who will contact me and say something like, I'm interested in writing a paper on this topic. Can you give me some recommendations? And I start laughing because I'm kind of old school in the sense that when I was an undergraduate and a graduate student, you know, Google Books and all this other stuff didn't exist. Like you had to go into the library and know the Dewey Decimal System and go into the stacks and get books. And nowadays, you don't necessarily have to answer some of these questions to professors. You can educate yourself that we have a lot of resources. So I would just say take advantage of the resources and, you know, strive to increase one's consciousness.
Very cool. Thank you. And I have dropped links to all the books you mentioned into the chat, and I will email them out to folks tomorrow. So thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate your knowledge and your insight and your perspective. We all have a lot to learn. Our guest next week is the Reverend Canon Debbie Royals, who is a Pascua Yaqui and the Canon for Native American Ministries in the Diocese of Arizona. And she'll be talking with us about Native American and Indigenous people and what we might owe to them. So everybody in the chat say thank you to Dr. Dagbovie. Here we go. We have so many thank yous. So thank you very much for your time. And I appreciate you coming in from a beautiful day outside to spend it with us.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right. Bye, everyone.